This is Joseph Drust, and welcome back to another episode of Ask ZBrush. So we had a question sent in asking, what is the best way to create a new VDM brush? So to start off, I just have ZBrush loaded up, and I just have a Polymesh 3D star here loaded in. And the question is asking about the best way to create a VDM, or a vector displacement mesh brush inside of ZBrush. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up Lightbox. So I'm going to click this button here or press comma on your keyboard. And then in here, I'm going to make sure I'm in the project area. I'm going to locate the miscellaneous folder and then double click this. And then in here, I want to grab this brush 3D template right here. And I'm just going to double click this. Now, since this is a project file, you're going to get a little dialog that's going to pop up. I'm going to click no to the dialog. And this is now going to load in this plain 3D object here. I'm going to turn off my floor grid, and I'm going to switch my material to matte cap gray, and then I'm going to change my color to white. And if I turn on my polyframes, you'll see that this is just a simple plain 3D object that has some subdivisions already pre-applied. So to create a VDM brush, you have to start from a plain 3D object. So these templates here that are stored inside a Lightbox are already pre-set up, so all you need to do is load one of these, and then you can start sculpting the shapes that you want to generate a VDM from. So for this example, I'm just going to make a quick scale. So I'm going to switch to my move brush by pressing B on my keyboard, isolating by the letter M, and then pressing V, which is going to select the move brush. I'm going to make sure I have symmetry turned on, and I'm just going to move to the side here and get a large draw size. Turn off my polyframes. I'm just going to pull out a quick little scale design here. And the power of the VDMs are that they allow for overhangs. So make sure when you're sculpting these that you're sculpting areas that do have overhangs. So the scale here has this nice overhang at the bottom. So that's going to allow us to create some nice forms on our models. Now after I have the initial shape pulled out, I'm just going to go to the Geometry tab here and just scale up the subdivisions to level 9 here. Now I'm going to switch to the clay buildup brush by hitting B on my keyboard, isolating by the letter C, and then pressing B to select the clay buildup brush. I'm going to turn off symmetry by pressing X on my keyboard. I'm going to get a smaller draw size here. And I'm just going to sculpt some additional features here on this scale. So just adding a little more kind of texture to the surface here. So nothing too precise, just coming in and adding some strokes across the surface here. Just sculpting these in really quick. Going in and out by holding Alt to sculpt inward, and then just sculpting without Alt to sculpt in a positive direction. I'm just tailoring this shape just a little bit more. It's just adding some different elements on the top here. So after you're happy with the sculpt that you've done here on the plane, we now just want to make sure that none of the border edges have been distorted in this process. So you want to make sure that the square area around the sculpture here is completely square. So I'm just going to apply some masking really quick, and to do this I'm going to hold down Control, which is going to give me my mask pen, and I'm just going to drag off my model on a blank spot of the canvas. This is going to give me this masking box. And I'm just going to come through and mask all the edges around my VDM here. So just making sure I get those borders all masked. Now I want to invert my mask, so I'm going to hold Control and then click off in an empty spot on my canvas. This is going to invert the mask that's applied to the model. And now I'm going to go to the tool palette. I'm going to go down to the deformation area here, open this up. And in here we have a relax plane grid and a morph to grid. So if we've distorted our grid quite a bit, you can use this relax plane grid, and that will attempt to add more geometry in the stretched areas. And then the morph to grid will just morph your entire mesh back to the flat grid surface. So since we have these unmasked portions of our plane here, if I use this morph to grid now, it's just going to morph it back to that plane 3D. And it's just going to make sure we don't have any distortion in those areas that may have occurred while we were sculpting. Now to create a VDM brush from our subtool here, we just need to come to the brush palette and first select a brush that supports VDM. So you can select any brush in this process, but if you want the sculptural details to look identical to what you've sculpted to the plane, you must select a chisel brush. These brushes here are already set up to handle the VDM processes. Now, if I selected, say, a standard brush and do this process, it's going to generate a brush out of my subtool. However, it's not going to contain the information needed to make sure that shape gets transferred directly to our model. So you want to make sure that you've selected one of these chisel brushes before you do this process. So I'm just going to select the chisel 3D brush here and just select that. And now the chisel 3D brush should load, and you'll see it already contains all these different elements. So I want to create a new chisel brush out of my subtool I've selected. So I'm going to make sure I have that chisel brush selected. I'm going to go to the brush palette up here and open this up. I'm going to open up the Create menu, and I'm now just simply going to click Create MultiAlpha Brush. Now, even though I have only one subtool here, this will still create a new chisel brush for me. So just because it says multi-alpha does not mean that it's not going to create a brush if you only have one subtool. So with this single subtool here, if I click this button, it's now going to create a new chisel brush for me. Now you'll notice at the top here that I now have a new chisel brush generated, and the IMM bar at the top may look a little funny. And this is because it is not refreshed. So you can see I have my subtool here, but then I still have these ghosted objects from the original Chisel 3D brush. So you just need to come up here and click and drag, and that will remove those. And you should now only have one single object loaded in this IMM viewer bar. And this should be the subtool that we currently have in our scene. So I've just transferred this subtool, and since it was generated on a plain 3D object, this subtool is now being created as a VDM part. So you can see in the alpha here, it contains the word 3D. So now if I come over here to the tool palette and say grab this sphere 3D object, and make this a poly mesh and then divide it up some. So just hitting Control plus D on my keyboard to divide this up. And I'm just going to divide it up to around 520,000 points. And now if I click and drag on the surface, you'll see that the VDM shape should draw out, and I'll get that scale. And so now I can come through and start generating scales across the surface of a model. So really handy feature to get different details and undercuts generated quickly on a mesh. Now after you have this brush created, we can now save this brush out and also generate an icon for it. So to generate an icon, you just need to position a model on your canvas. So I'm going to take the sphere here and just position this like so. I'm going to go up to the brush palette up here and open this up. I'm going to hover over the Select Icon button here. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then click, and this will now generate a new icon based on what you see on the canvas. So you can see here now I have an icon for the brush I just created. Now after you have this created, you want to save this out. So I'm going to go to the brush palette up here and now go to Save As. And this should automatically open up to the brush presets folder. And so if you store any brush in your ZBrush 4.8 Z Startup brush presets folder, these brushes will load on the next ZBrush start. So I'm just going to label this as Chisel Scale. And then just click Save. And I have now successfully saved that brush. Now you will notice that since I had that original Chisel 3D brush selected, if I go back to my brush palette over here, you can see that the Chisel 3D brush has now been removed. And this is because when you created this new Insert Multi-Alpha brush, it basically did a replace. So it took that Chisel 3D brush and replaced it with the new one you just generated. So to get the original Chisel 3D brush back, you can either just close ZBrush and restart, or you can come down here in the brush palette and click this Reset All Brushes. So when you click this, this will now load all those brushes again. And if I go back to my brush palette over here, you'll see that the Chisel 3D brush is back. And then it has also loaded in the Chisel Scale that I saved into the brush presets folder. So now I have both these brushes living inside of ZBrush. Now as another example, I'm just going to load in another ZPR file here with some other subtools that I've created to generate VDM brushes out of. So I'm just going to load these in quick. And now I have that loaded in. And to start off, I just want to go through and explain what happens if you have a subtool that contains parts that were generated from a grid plane and some that were generated like insert mesh brushes. So here I have a quick tool, and this one consists of various parts. So I have some parts here that contain interpenetrating geometry and are not generated on a grid plane, so like this button here. And then I have other ones that are generated from that grid plane. And this tool just contains a variety of all those. So let's say I take this now and I create a multi-alpha brush out of this. So I'm going to go back to my brush palette over here and open this up, and I'm going to select the Chisel 3D brush again. I'm going to go back up to the brush area up here. I'm going to make sure that Create menu is still open there. And now I'm going to click Create MultiAlpha Brush. Now when I click Create MultiAlpha Brush this time, ZBrush is going to go through all the subtools in the scene here. So it's going to look at every single subtool I have here and create a new part out of that. Now since I have a mixture of meshes that are generated from that grid plane and some that are not, ZBrush is going to take any of the ones that are generated from that grid plane and automatically turn those into VDM parts. And then any of the other parts that were not generated from the grid plane, these are just going to be created as normal alphas. So by clicking this Create MultiAlpha Brush here, you'll see I get a new brush generated. Once again, you need to go up to your IMM viewer bar and just simply click and drag, and that will refresh that. And you can see now I have all these parts in this brush. So you can see the ones that were created from the grid plane still have their plane surrounding their surface. And if you click on these guys in the alpha panel here, you're going to see it's going to say 3D. So this is now a VDM part. If I click one of the other ones that were just created as you would a normal insert mesh brush, you're going to see there is no 3D label on the alpha here. So this is just going to come in as a 2D alpha. So you can generate brushes that contain a mixture of both VDM parts and also 2D alphas. So let's go and grab a object here really quick. And I'm going to make this a polymesh again. And then hit Control D to divide this up. So I can divide up to around 520,000 points again. Now with this brush selected, I have the button here, which is not a 3D alpha. So if I drag this out, I'm going to get this effect. So it will be just generating the result you're seeing on your mesh as it would if it was just a normal 2D alpha. But then if I say switch to a VDM part, like the spine here, you see it now, it says 3D on the alpha over there. And if I drag this out, this will now be read as that VDM, and it's going to give me those undercuts. So you can generate a brush with a mixture of VDM parts and regular alphas. So that is the process to create a VDM brush inside of ZBrush. So you first just want to make sure you start from a grid plane. And if you go to the project area inside a Lightbox, go to the miscellaneous folder and open that up. In here you have a bunch of ZPR project files you can choose from. You just want to load one of these in, sculpt on that plane, and then after that shape has been generated, you just want to make sure you position it on your canvas. Then select a brush that is a chisel brush. So we have the chisel, chisel 3D, chisel creature, and chisel rectangle. Just select one of these. And then after that brush is selected, you want to go to the brush palette up here, open this up. You want to go to the Create menu, and then you just want to simply click Create MultiAlpha Brush. And that will create a new VDM brush for you. And just refresh the IMM bar at the top here. And now we should have a new VDM brush created. Now you can select any primitive shapes that even have subdivisions. And you can use this brush and it'll generate the VDM result. So if you have any other questions related to ZBrush pipelines or processes, please use the hashtag AskZBrush on Twitter. Happy ZBrushing!